Once parents, caregivers, teachers, and other adults start to realize that some of the behaviors exhibited by kids with mood disorders are actually symptoms and not willful choices, things start to shift in every aspect of their interactions. But with that realization, other obstacles arise. The most important of which is how can you tell the difference between symptoms and old fashioned misbehaving? Well, believe it or not, most children with mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and fear of harm don't actually misbehave very much in the traditional sense of that word. Usually, they've spent years being reprimanded or punished over symptomatic behaviors they couldn't control. And when they aren't symptomatic, the last thing they want to do is misbehave and get into trouble. Most of the time, when the symptoms are quiet, children with mood disorders tend to be loving, insightful, bright, downright charming kids. Primary caregivers often report that they see two versions of the child, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Bruce Banner and the Hulk. And adults convince themselves that there must be some way to make the child be their loving, charming selves all of the time. But that's not possible because the behaviors that are seen as problematic are often symptom driven and are rarely by choice. And there's no incentive, reward, or extrinsic motivation that can stop the involuntary changes in mood or surges in symptoms. So, when adults are confronted with a child or teen's behavior that requires modification or intervention, how are they supposed to respond? Well, there's a complicated answer here that begins with taking a step back and thinking things through before responding. It involves asking, is this person actually misbehaving or are they experiencing a symptom? If the answer is no, this is not a symptom, then we have a few follow-up questions to ask. Is this a leftover behavior being engaged in out of habit, a habit that might be modified? Do they actually know how to make another choice? Do they have any experience with trying a different strategy? And this is hard for some adults to wrap their minds around. They think that if a child or teen knows what to do, then they should always be able to do it. But that's simply not true. If you've always responded in a particular way to something, it's incredibly hard to simply change that response to something else based purely on intellectual knowledge when there's no muscle memory for how to do it any other or more desirable way. Think of it this way. If you've ever been to a community pool, you've probably heard the lifeguards continuously shouting at kids, "Don't run." And do they stop running? Usually, no, they don't. But why not? Simply put, children don't stop what they're doing unless they know what to do instead. This is why it's more effective for those lifeguards to shout, "Walk, please," rather than "Don't run." This is also why it's more effective to tell kids, "Put your hands in your pockets," instead of telling them, "Don't touch anything." Or why it's more effective to kindly say, "Why don't you tell me what's wrong?" instead of "Stop crying." Whether you think about what you're doing as managing symptoms or avoiding problematic behaviors, the intervention is based on the same idea, and how instructions and requests are framed can make a significant difference. Behaviors that are habits need to be pointed out in order for them to be noticed before one can work on changing them. All children, but especially those with mood disorders, need their trusted grown-ups to help them identify old habits that are appearing when and where they don't belong. If this is done without shaming, without punishment, or the threat of consequences, they will be more open and available to replacing those old habits with new, more constructive behaviors. If you're thinking that learning to tell the difference between misbehavior and symptoms and modifying habitual behaviors might be harder than it sounds, you're right, it is, especially at first. But we can make the process a lot easier if we remember that all behavior has a purpose. Nothing children, teens, or adults do is random or pointless. There is always an internal logic that helps to clarify why each behavior is happening and what it's helping to accomplish. For a child who's defiantly refusing to get ready for bed, what is this accomplishing? Well, it's delaying when they get into bed, right? When we refocus our thinking this way, we can figure out what threat, fear, anxiety, or other undesirable emotional response has been triggered by the task. Then we can focus on addressing or resolving that underlying problem that's driving the behavior instead. With the elimination of the problem, the difficult behavior usually recedes. Behaviors become more compliant because the underlying concern has been addressed. We'll talk in the video Discipline with a Mood Disorder about specific strategies and approaches to discipline that work better for kids and teens with mood disorders, bipolar disorder, or fear of harm. So for now, let's dig into distinguishing between active symptoms and misbehaving. We'd be lying if we said it was easy or that once you know what to look for will always be obvious. But the truth is that there's more art than science to the skill, and we're not going to share with you strategies or a set of rules that are written in stone or that are based on years of complex scientific research. What we're going to do is give you information, a set of supportive guidelines, if you will, that have come from years of practice by parents, therapists, teachers, and caregivers. Their successes and the depth and breadth of their communal knowledge brought together and shared in support groups, homeschool co-ops, and the like have helped this set of guidelines come into focus. Real live people use these strategies and they help. First things first. If a child is actively symptomatic and they're elevated into a heightened state, such as their fight or flight response, we may have to accept that until that response ends, there may not be much that can be done to force the symptom to stop. Tantrums, explosive outbursts, panic attacks, crying episodes, and the like may simply need to be endured until they end of their own accord. Adults need to remind themselves throughout the episode that the behaviors are symptoms and that those symptoms are first and foremost wreaking havoc on the child. The child or teen is exhausted, they are overwhelmed, and they're most likely afraid. These are not behaviors to be disciplined. We do our best to keep that child and others in the environment safe, but the adult's primary purpose during these outbursts is to soothe, to reassure, and to remain calm and steady. In these cases, the adult is the rock, the tether to reality, and our best hope of weathering the storm is to make sure the child or teen knows that when it's over, their trusted grown-up will still be there, still love them, and still be willing to help. Typical symptom-driven behaviors for kids and teens with mood disorders, bipolar disorder, or fear of harm are often misinterpreted as chosen behaviors and get mischaracterized by adults as misbehaving. You'll want to be on the lookout for some of the common ones, which include speaking rudely to other kids or adults, manic and hypomanic behaviors, perfectionism that can lead to task resistance and avoidance, intolerance of being teased, even affectionately. So let's take a deeper dive into each of these items. As we've said before, in children and adolescents, irritability and low frustration tolerance are key ways that depression, mania, and anxiety all present in children and adolescents. This leads to behaviors such as negative tone of voice or word choices and poor volume modulation that make adults think they're trying to be rude, disrespectful, or aggressive. But these symptomatic behaviors are not communicating any of that. They're actually saying, I'm in distress. Help me. Another symptomatic behavior that's often seen as a behavioral choice is mania or hypomania. The behaviors that go along with hypomania and mania include racing thoughts, hyperactivity, distractibility, irritability, restlessness, and fixations which can all lead to problematic behaviors at home, school, or social activities that can often be mistaken for ADHD symptoms. Because sometimes the child can't sit still or stay seated, can't stay in line while walking or standing, can't wait their turn, can't be quiet or control the volume of their voice, can't stop talking, laughing, or being silly, or can't stop touching things. A child doing these things is going to be perceived as a disruption to their environment, but when the child is exhibiting these behaviors as a result of a manic or hypomanic episode, there isn't anything they can do to stop, and most likely, despite appearing silly and giddy, they're feeling ashamed and anxious that they can't exert the control over themselves that others are expecting. Perfectionism is a common trait in kids with mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and fear of harm, which often goes unrecognized because it can manifest itself in some unexpected ways. Many people believe it's task resistance or task avoidance because they see the rigidity and unwillingness to try new things, unwillingness to practice or attempt things they haven't mastered yet, and resistance to completing assigned work, such as schoolwork or chores, and they see it as some kind of laziness or defiance. But these behaviors stem from a perfectionism driven by an oversized fear of failure, which for a child with a mood disorder, especially with fear of harm, can be experienced as an existential threat. The child experiences not trying as a much safer option with fewer unknowns. Not trying is less intimidating than making attempts that fail. This exaggerated fear of failure stems from the child or adolescent's misperception that there's no recovery from failure, that it's a permanent mark against them, that everyone will know they have failed, and they fear that failure will lead to rejection and isolation, which is intolerable. A misspelled word on a homework assignment, or even the fear of potentially misspelling a word may be enough to make the prospect of completing homework so terrifying that the fight or flight instinct or a panic attack is triggered. To the outside observer, this seems ridiculous, but to the child so deeply afraid of failure, perfection or nothing at all are the only viable options they can see. This last symptom-driven behavior involves a complete inability to laugh at oneself and an unwillingness to be laughed at, even when that laughter is affectionate, good-natured, and loving. The child with a mood disorder fears being excluded from the group, ostracized by the group, or isolated from the group because even good-hearted teasing, joking, or playfulness can be interpreted as a forerunner to exclusion, which triggers defensive and reactive behaviors. Over time, you may discover additional behaviors that are specific to your child, which have felt like intentional misbehaviors but are actually symptom-driven. Your developing awareness of the symptoms and their effects will help guide you in your interpretation of behavior.